From some of the most creative brains to a kid with echolocation abilities, here are 10 people who have been given superpowers after unfortunate accidents. 10. Ken Walters. Mr. Ken Walters began life as an engineer. Well, he began as a baby and later upgraded to an engineer. But when a horrible accident caused Mr. Walters to suffer serious spinal damage and brutal injuries to his insides, he became stuck in a wheelchair. This continued for 19 long and miserable years until, after suffering 2 heart attacks, Mr. Walters suffered a massive stroke. But this stroke had the power to change his life. One day, he was going to ask the nurse for a pill, and as he couldn't speak because of the pain, he decided to write a note in a paper sheet. Amazingly, he started to draw, and they weren't simple drawings. He drew with many details, shadows, and volumes, which surprised him because he never took art classes. According to CNET, Mr. Walters recovered from his stroke with a rewired mind and a flair for art which he'd never previously had. Mr. Walters was quoted saying, "I hated it in school, I was never really the arty type." And yet, here he was with sudden artistic abilities. Mr. Walters soon began making a living out of his doodling by transforming it into impressive digital art and creating special artistic software. Mr. Walters made incredibly creative mythical creatures from strange and terrifying dimensions, and he was eventually spotted by the video game giant Electronic Arts. At the end of the day, the horrible accident gave Ken Walters the superhuman ability to be a great artist, and EA went on to commission him for special digital work. Who knows where Ken Walters' art will take him next? 9. Alonzo Clemens. Whether Alonzo Clemens developed his talent as a sculptor because of the brain injury he sustained as a child, or he simply inherited it, well, it is yet to be scientifically proven, but that doesn't stop Alonzo from getting on this list. After suffering a horrible brain injury as a young boy, he was left with an IQ of somewhere around 45 and severe developmental issues. And yet, he is one of the most talented sculptors in the world. In fact, Alonzo had his premiere exhibit in Aspen, Colorado in 1986, and since then his works have sold upwards of $40,000. Pretty good for a guy who got bonked on the head as a child. He's one of the best sculptors on Earth. Alonzo can typically sculpt a ridiculously lifelike statue of an animal within minutes, anything from an antelope to a horse. His hands are so skilled that they can reproduce almost any image seen by his eyes within minutes. This is one of those special superpowers that often go unnoticed, but luckily, Alonzo has managed to make a life out of his sculpting. He is really quite amazing to watch in action. And now for number 8. But first, if you could have any superpower, what would it be? Let me know in the comments below, and if you are new here, be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell so you don't miss out on more videos like these. 8. Nikolay Gliachenko. A 12-year-old boy from Russia undoubtedly has one of the best superpowers on the list. He also has the most intense origin story out of any real-life person. While he was walking home from school one day in Mother Russia, the boy stopped to lean against a lamppost. Unfortunately for him, he ended up getting blasted with a jolt of electricity that sent him flying across the street. After the accident, Nikolay awoke to find himself no worse for wear. He made it back to his house all by himself. However, the next day, strange things started to happen. The New York Post reports that Nikolay claimed metal objects were being stuck to his body, like utensils and coins. Just one look at the images of the boy covered in pieces of metal is enough to impress. Nikolay is not the only one with this strange ability either. There have been multiple stories about magnetized people professing a strange bond with metal objects, although I think a real-world Magneto is out of the cards, at least for now. 7. Orlando Serrell. It may seem a little silly, but a superhuman memory would come in extremely heavy. With a superhuman memory, you would be able to remember everything you ever read, everything you ever heard, and everything you ever saw. This would increase your mental capacity by a lot. Unfortunately, this type of memory is extremely rare. A man named Orlando Serrell was given a similar gift only after being hit over the left side of his head with a baseball at the prime age of 10. Orlando developed a headache for several days following the bat incident, and after his headache went away, he realized that he could remember every single day since the day of his accident. And not only could he remember the day, but he could remember exactly what he had done on that day, including what the weather had been like. All the events of his life on a minute-by-minute basis simply appeared in his mind, and it still works to this day. Also, he was able to do calendrical calculations, which means he could predict the weather of the next few days. It is an incredible gift of memory, especially considering halfway through this video, some of us have forgotten what day it is. Memory is definitely a tricky thing. 6. Tommie McHugh. Another creative genius who rose from a horrible accident was Tommie McHugh. He was born in 1949 and spent most of his early life involved in crime and working as a builder. Actually, his life wasn't in a good way. He used to participate in club fights, consume drugs, and waste his time. But when Tommie was 51, he suffered an extremely unfortunate incident, and quite frankly, it was embarrassing too. Tommie was on the toilet trying to do his things when he strained so hard that pressure caused 2 blood vessels to burst, one in his frontal lobe and the other in his temporal lobe. Tommie was then sent into a coma for a full week. When Tommie was relearning after this toilet stroke, he took up a sudden yearning to create poetry, sculptures, and many other plastic works. Tommie soon became a brilliant artist. Somehow, when his brain rewired itself after the stroke, Tommie found himself extremely talented. Unfortunately, Tommie died in 2012 from a bad case of cancer, yet he still lives on through his artwork. Who says creativity can't be a superpower? 5. Rory Curtis. Many of us have dreamed of learning a foreign language. At the same time, most of us are too lazy to ever go about doing it. It takes way too much work, too much studying, and too much memorization. But what if you could wake up one morning and speak fluent French? And what if all it took was a little bit of a brain injury? Well, Rory Curtis, an amateur football player from the UK, woke after a vehicle accident to find himself muttering in perfect French. The nurse who attended Rory happens to be a French speaker by birth, and she was so impressed with Rory's natural intonation and accent that she asked his father which part of France Rory was from. However, Rory's ability to speak French vanished almost as quickly as it came, and it has yet to come back. Some people claim his knowledge of French was a memory passed down through generations, but of course, there is no real scientific explanation for what happened. It was merely a burst of superhuman language, perhaps memories from hearing it as a child. 4. Adam Rayner. This is perhaps the most miraculous, bizarre, and chilling story involving one man's struggle through life from a real dwarf to a massive giant. There's only one recorded case of this ever happening in medical history, according to Business Insider. At the age of 18, Adam Rayner presented to the army, but he could not apply because he was legally considered a dwarf as he was only 4 feet with 6.3 inches, 1.38 meters. What happened next was nothing short of fantastical. From being less than 5 feet at the age of 19, Rayner began to grow exponentially at the age of 21 until he reached an astounding 7'2", 2.18 meters, when he was 32 years old. This was caused by a tumor that had been growing inside of Adam's body, producing excess growth hormones inside of his body. His hands and feet were abnormally large, and he had a forehead and jaw like a caveman. Adam eventually went blind in his right eye, began to suffer hearing loss, and was confined to a bed due to drastic spinal deformity. He died at the age of 51 at almost 8 feet tall, 2.4 meters. He was the only man to ever be considered a dwarf and a giant in his life. Who would have thought an accidental tumor could cause such a growth? 3. Antonio Alfonseca. Does being born with extra digits on your hands and feet count as an accident? I mean, it is technically a genetic accident. This condition, known as polydactylism, is only reported in about 1 of every 500 children. Upon studying this, its results are incredible. 1 in every 500 children are born with an extra toe, an extra finger, or whatever extra extremities they might be growing. In the case of Antonio Alfonseca, he has an extra toe on each foot and an extra finger on each hand. He's also a baseball superstar. While Antonio claims that his extra fingers don't actually affect his pitching, who knows what's really going on there? Antonio's friends call him El Pulpo or the Octopus. He's even been known as Six Fingers. He is one of the only people with this kind of genetic mutation who have turned it into a brand. Antonio has played for the Chicago Cubs, the Atlanta Braves, the Texas Rangers, and many others. You might call him a superpowered pitcher. And he has exactly 4 more digits than most of us. 2. Tony Correa. At 42 years old, Tony Correa was an average guy. It was 1994, he had just finished making a phone call with his mother from a public telephone, he was about to walk away, and suddenly, he saw his own body lying on the ground awash in a strange bluish-white light. See, what happened was that Mr. Correa had been struck by lightning. It was a miracle that a nearby woman was an intensive care nurse and was able to resuscitate Tony, and while he suffered burns on his face and his left foot from where the lightning charge had entered and then exited his body, the real results of his meeting with Mother Nature were pronounced several weeks later. Inexplicably, Tony began to feel a deep desire to sit down and listen to some piano music. It literally consumed him, and all he could think of were the classical sounds of a piano. He even went out and bought a piano and then taught himself how to play. For a guy who grew up in the 60s on rock and roll, he was confused to find himself playing and composing classical music on his piano. Apparently, the lightning strike had somehow unleashed something within Tony's mind that rebirthed him as a classical musician. Now, Tony may not be able to fly or leap over tall buildings in a single bound, but waking up one morning and being able to play the piano is still pretty rad if you ask me. 1. Ben Underwood. Meet Ben Underwood. According to his mother and the Huffington Post, Ben was born the happiest kid in the world, but when Ben turned 2 years old, he could not see out of his left eye. Soon after, a visit to the doctor proved that Ben had retinoblastoma, cancer in both of his eyes. After undergoing chemotherapy and radiation to no avail, Ben had to go through surgery to have his eyes completely removed from his head. It was at the age of 7 when he discovered an astonishing gift. On the Oprah Winfrey Show, Ben told the host that one time while at camp, he started to click his tongue and it became a navigational tool. From then on, Ben could use the clicking of his tongue like echolocation to view the world. Ben said that the clicking of his tongue allowed him to literally hear the things around him. It allowed him to find people, walls, doorways, and even drops on the curb while he walked on the sidewalk. Unfortunately, Ben died in 2009. He was remembered by roughly 2,500 people at his funeral. This is an incredibly sad story of a boy who could not live his full life with his echolocation superpower and his enormous heart. Which of these superhuman abilities would you like to have? Which do you think is the most amazing? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.